important. WOLA's work has never been more critical, and it has never been more challenging. We are operating in an environment where funding for human rights work is under threat, where speaking truth carries real cost. Your support allows us to continue our work, and that's why I ask you to please consider making a donation today by visiting our website or reaching out to any member of our team after the program. Every contribution matters. Every contribution strengthens our fight for democracy and human rights in the Americas. So, gracias. Thank you. Now, let me tell you about our first awardee, MOVIR, the Movement of Victims of the Regime from El Salvador. El Salvador today is experiencing one of the most severe human rights crises in our hemisphere. Under President Nayib Bukele, under his state of emergency, over 90,000 people have been arbitrarily detained. El Salvador now has the highest incarceration rate in the entire world. Thousands sit in prison without charges, without due process, without knowing when or if they will see their loved ones again. Torture and ill treatment are widespread. And yet, even in this environment of fear, of repression, Salvadorian civil society continues to resist with extraordinary courage. Today, we honor one of those organizations, MOVIR, el Movimiento de Víctimas del Régimen. MOVIR is a grassroots movement made up of people who have directly suffered under Bukele's state of emergency. Mothers searching for their sons, families demanding justice for loved ones arbitrarily detained, communities devastated by state violence. They are organizing inside El Salvador to demand accountability, to document abuses, to reclaim the democratic space that has been systematically destroyed. And they do know the risk that they pose. But MOVIR does this knowing that if they don't fight for their rights and the rights of their loved ones, who will? If they don't document the abuses and they don't document what's happening, these things will be forgotten. If they don't organize, Bukele's narrative that there are no victims, only criminals, will be the only story told. They remind us that even in the face of overwhelming state power, people continue to organize, to resist, to demand their dignity. And they remind us that our solidarity matters, that when we amplify their voices, when we stand with them, we make their work possible and help protect them from being silenced entirely. I would love if you join me in watching this tribute to MOVIR's vital work.
On March 27, 2022, El Salvador declared a state of exception. What was meant to be a 30-day measure has been renewed every month since. Over 90,000 people have been detained. Thousands of them are innocent. Into this crisis stepped the victims themselves. On August 12, 2022, they formed MOVIR, the Movement of Victims of the Regime.
Bueno, MOVIR surge a partir de la violación de los derechos humanos. Dijimos, aquí no hay otra que las víctimas se organicen y que ellas mismas exijan sus derechos. Y así fue como surge MOVIR.
MOVIR está formado por víctimas del régimen, o sea, personas que tienen a privados de libertad, familiares, hermanos, hijos, esposos, todo. Eso es MOVIR.
MOVIR is victim-led, grassroots, fearless. They document prison conditions and denounce abuses. They organize marches to make victims visible. They teach families to file habeas corpus requests. They connect victims with mutual aid and resources. They raise awareness about democracy's deterioration in El Salvador.
O sea, la gente se siente que MOVIR es de ellos. No, que MOVIR somos todos. O sea, ahí no hay líderes.
Todos los que andamos luchando por los inocentes somos Movir.
Nosotros todos somos Movir, porque cada uno tiene su familiar que está detenido.
The risks they face are real. The government has labeled human rights work as subversion. Defenders face harassment, surveillance, and arrest. International organizations have documented deteriorating prison conditions, extreme overcrowding, cruel and inhuman treatment, and torture. But Movir continues.
Para nosotros
Yes. Now, to our second Human Rights Awardee today. It is, unfortunately, in Washington, principal voices on Latin America are rare. But there are leaders who have maintained a consistent, values-driven approach to Latin America, regardless of political winds. Leaders who understand that what happens in our hemisphere matters deeply for our own democracy and security. Leaders who stand with civil society even when it's difficult. Senator Tim Kaine is one of those leaders. His connection to Latin America runs deep and is personally very profound. When he was just 22 years old, Senator Kaine took a year off from law school to work as a missionary in El Progreso, Honduras. This wasn't a brief visit. It was a transformative experience that shaped his entire worldview. Senator Kaine has said that that year in Honduras changed his life. And throughout his political career, as mayor of Richmond, as governor of Virginia, and now as a U.S. senator, he has carried those lessons with him. In the Senate, Senator Kaine has been a consistent champion for democracy and human rights across Latin America. Let me give you just a few examples. In 2021, he led the bipartisan Renacer Act, legislation that uses diplomatic tools and targeted sanctions to address corruption and support democracy and human rights in Nicaragua. He stood with journalists facing violence in Mexico, introducing resolutions to condemn their murders and call for accountability. More recently, he's been at the forefront of holding the U.S. government accountable for its ongoing strike against votes in the Caribbean, introducing and forcing a vote on a world powers resolution. What makes Senator Kaine's leadership so distinctive is not just the breadth of his work, but its consistency. He doesn't pick and choose when to care about human rights based on who is in power or what's politically convenient. That kind of integrity is rare, yet that kind of principle is essential. Senator Kaine's voice reminds us that U.S. policy can and should stand on the side of democracy and human dignity. His work reminds us that solidarity with Latin American society isn't a partisan issue, it's a moral imperative. Please join me in honoring Senator Tim Kaine.
Hey everybody, Senator Tim Kaine here. I'm so honored to receive the 2025 Washington Office of Latin America Human Rights Award. WOLA's work is essential to advancing a principled U.S. foreign policy approach to the hemisphere. I don't just know this from my work in the Senate. I know this firsthand from my time doing mission work in Honduras 45 years ago. My experience in El Progreso forever shaped the way I see the world. More needs to be done to help the needy, to those who go hungry at night, and those who yearn to live in a democratic society. WOLA's publications were a beacon of hope when I lived in Honduras, and your work continues to be a beacon today. Throughout its history, WOLA has been at the forefront of advancing human rights, democracy, and justice in Latin America. From calling out the growing authoritarianism in El Salvador to protecting democracy here in the United States, WOLA is an inspiration to freedom-loving individuals who are facing oppression within our hemisphere. I'm proud to have learned from WOLA's example. Having seen you as a beacon of light as a student, I'm even more proud to work alongside WOLA in my work as a U.S. Senator and as the lead Democrat on the Senate's panel responsible for the Western Hemisphere. It's essential that we continue to work together to stand up against authoritarians in the region and authoritarianism right here at home. We have to insist on protecting democratic institutions, fostering better commercial ties, and upholding the rule of law and human rights in the Western Hemisphere. Thanks again for giving me the honor of receiving this 2025 Washington Office of Latin America Human Rights Award. I look forward to working hand in hand with WOLA for many years to come.
We're very grateful for Senator Tim Kaine's words, and we're very honored to honor him with this award. We have just honored two examples of courage in the face of authoritarianism, one from civil society in El Salvador, one from the US Senate. Now I want to turn to someone who can help us understand the broader patterns we are seeing both in Latin America and here in the United States. WOLA is deeply honored to welcome Dr. Stephen Levitsky for this inaugural lecture. Dr. Levitsky is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government at Harvard University, where he also directs the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. He's a senior fellow at the Kettering Foundation and a senior democracy fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weak institutions, with a particular focus on Latin America. But I'm sure many of you will know him from his book, How Democracies Die, which he co-authored with Daniel Ziblatt in 2018. This book became a New York Times bestseller, has been published in 30 languages, and warned Americans that the democracy in the US was not as exceptional or invulnerable as we all like to believe. Few scholars understand the US and Latin American context as deeply as Dr. Levitsky does. And few, I believe, can help us see the parallels between forces undermining democracy in our hemispheres and the threats we face here at home. Dr. Levitsky, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Steve, as I said, you are very well known for the book you published in 2018, How Democracies Die. The book became a New York Times bestseller, and you reminded all Americans that democracy wasn't exceptional. And many tend to believe that it is, but you actually made a call to save it. That was 2018. You have published different academic articles, and you have spoken extensively about democracy since then. What are your main reflections 7 years after the book was published?
I would say my main reflection is that it's been worse than we thought. We were considered pretty alarmist and pretty pessimistic back when we wrote that book in 2018, and looking back, it has gotten considerably worse than we anticipated. The biggest change, one thing that we didn't anticipate, was the really rapid and thorough personal takeover of the Republican Party by Donald Trump. When we wrote the book, we expected that the Republican Party, that elements of the Republican Party would be able and willing to constrain Trump. It wasn't a Trumpized political party. But there has been a rapid and thorough process, if you forgive me going into Spanish, of Trumpización of the Republican Party that I just didn't anticipate, and that has allowed that plus the Republicans' control over the Congress has allowed this second Trump administration to really bypass our checks and balances in a way that very, very few people, including the framers of our Constitution, could have anticipated. So we can go on and on, but we are. This is not reversible. It's not a the kind of dictatorship that Latin Americans confronted in the 1970s. It's what Luke and Way and I call competitive authoritarianism. It's relatively mild so far, and it's very reversible, which we can talk about. But for now, Americans have lost our democracy. North Americans have lost our democracy.
Thank you. Before we continue, I do want to remind everyone who is listening and watching that you can leave your questions in the Q&A that you can find there in Zoom. So please, while Steve and I speak, feel free to drop your questions because we will have a Q&A session after in a little while. Let me take what you just said, Steve, and you elaborated a bit on this in the article you published in Foreign Policy in February. And you wanted to make that difference. The U.S. will not become Latin America, meaning Latin America in the 70s. We will not see in the U.S. the type of classic dictatorships that Latin American countries experienced, especially in the Southern Cone. And the U.S. will experience a competitive authoritarianism. Do you still feel the same way? I mean, would you elaborate a bit more on that? What does competitive authoritarianism means? And as we head to, elections in 2026 in November, how will that play in the U.S. according to what you have been witnessing?
Always hard to predict. So it is true. I still believe that the United States is not headed towards some aspects of Latin. It's not headed toward Pinochet. It's not headed towards the worst dictatorships that we saw in the 1970s, but it is very much headed towards Latin America in the sense that there have been many competitive authoritarian regimes in Latin America. I'm thinking of Fujimori's Peru. I'm thinking of late 20th century Mexico, Dominican Republic under Balaguer. More recently, Ecuador under Correa, Bolivia, Honduras under Hernandez. There have been many instances of competitive authoritarianism in the last few decades in Latin America, and that's where the United States is right there. What I mean by competitive authoritarianism is it's a hybrid political system in which elections exist, in which parties compete in elections. The opposition is not banned; it's legal, it's above board. It competes seriously for power. But the weaponization of the state, the abuse of state power is so systematic and so severe that it tilts the playing field against the opposition. It's you get real competition, but it's unfair competition and a pretty systematic abuse of state power. So the first decade of Chavez in Venezuela is a good example. Again, the classic, at least late 20th century Mexico under the PRI. I think Mexico is sliding back in that direction now. Very, very similar. The United States has never been more similar to the to Latin America than it is today. Now, could it get worse? Is I think the implication of your question. It could. I mean, there are signs of something worse, and what I worry about in particular are a couple of things. First of all, what is happening with the security forces? One thing that really stands out historically about the United States, and that is distinct from most of Latin America, is the professionalization of the armed forces, and the fact that executives have not been able to deploy the military to subvert democratic rule. Because the way you get from just tilting the playing field to outright dictatorship, to do that, you need some sort of autogolpe for which you need military support. You need the cooperation of the military. And the transformation of ICE into an unregulated thuggish paramilitary force that is routinely violating citizens' rights and is not accountable really to anybody is a very serious threat. And secondly, the president's instruction to the commanders of the most powerful armed forces on earth, telling them to refocus on internal enemies and to focus on a war from within in U.S. cities. That's Pinochet stuff, right? That's the kind of language that we did hear in South American dictatorships in the 1970s. And we don't know how far that will go, but this administration's willingness to declare national emergencies where they don't exist and to try to wield security forces against domestic enemies, that if that continues, that gets us out of competitive authoritarianism and potentially into something much worse.
So thank you for that answer. It's very sobering, but I think it sadly portrays what we are all witnessing. And
and taking people off the streets.
Mhm.
That doesn't happen in democracy.
Not only taking people out of the streets, we have argued that they have disappeared, they have committed enforced disappearances. The transfer of the 238 Venezuelan migrants to Secot was a moment where these people were, if you follow the elements of the International Convention on Enforced Disappearances, they could be categorized as such. Their loved ones did not know the whereabouts or fate of them, and for weeks until their names were leaked by private media, people didn't know where they were. So they were, taken by state agents to an unknown location, and we didn't know their whereabouts. I mean, basically that fits the category of enforced disappearance. So I agree with you. Very difficult times. Let's turn to Latin America, Steve, because it's a region you have studied for decades. And I have to say that sadly also, right, the optimism for democracy we witnessed at the beginning of this century is gone. The region faces significant challenges to democratic institutions, to human rights, and we have also seen the consolidation of, very repressive autocracies. What trends are you seeing right now, and how do you feel the policies of this administration in the U.S. are impacting those trends?
Okay, that's a complicated question. I think you're absolutely right that Latin American democracies and that Latin America faces a set of much more difficult challenges than it faced in 2000. Although the economies in 2000 were quite bad, but the last decade has been very difficult economically. Levels of violent crime and criminal violence have risen in many parts of the region and reached really untenable levels in some countries. The levels of public discontent are at an all-time high in almost every region in the country, every country in the region, excuse me. COVID made things much worse. Just like in other democracies, citizens came out of the COVID period much grumpier, much more discontented than before, and COVID hit Latin America harder than any other region of the world. And in addition to all that, the global environment is much, much less friendly to democracy than it was 25 years ago. 25 years ago, Russia was still in a state of collapse. China was just emerging. The United States and Western Europe were promoting democracy like never before, and as it turns out, like never since. It was a brief period in which democracy was really the only game in town, and that really benefited pro-democratic forces in Latin America. So if you go back to about the year 2000, that was roughly the high point in terms of favorable conditions for democracy, and we're nowhere near that today. I think, and I'll get to the Trump administration in a second, but I think that it's important to point out, and not everybody agrees with me, that there's an important glass half full story here. Despite all of the challenges that I just listed, horrible economic conditions, rising crime, terrible corruption scandals, COVID, the corrosive effects of social media, the polarizing effects of social media, the fact that the political right in Latin America has evolved from a pretty liberal center right to a much more illiberal and potentially authoritarian right. And the fact that you have in the United States, in the White House, a government that is completely uninterested in promoting democracy, and in fact is embracing some of the region's worst autocracies, particularly El Salvador. This is a government that is actively trying to undermine democracy in Brazil, and is embracing one of the region's most autocratic regimes in El Salvador. So far from democracy being the only game in town, democracy is being threatened from the north. Despite that, the level of democracy in Latin America today is about the same as it was in the year 2000. It's not true that there are more autocracies than before. There have always been a handful of autocracies. Which ones there are have shifted around. But there may be one fewer democracy today than there was 20 or 25 years ago. If you look at democracy indices like VDEM, maybe a couple of points below where we were 20 years ago, but it's pretty much been a flat line over the last 20 years. The fact that the region, and we continue to have turnover. Bolivia, whatever you think of the recent right-wing government, there has been electoral turnover in Bolivia. Ecuador was more autocratic under Correa than it is today. Guatemala is in a more democratic, it's very precarious, but a much more democratic place than it was 7 or 8 years ago. Colombia is in a more democratic place than it was early in the 21st century. So it is not true that the region, Venezuela is a disaster. Nicaragua and El Salvador are disasters. The rest of the region, despite very high levels of discontent, despite some pretty scary figures on the far right, continued to experience competitive elections, turnover, and broad protection of civil liberties, at least at the same level as 20 years ago. Because some of us are old enough to remember, Latin America wasn't Switzerland in the year 2000. It was always precarious protection of civil liberties and human rights in the region. So the fact that political competition continues in most of the region, that turnover continues in most of the region, is something that we have to pay attention to and applaud, because it's given the difficulty of conditions that the region faces. That is no small achievement. The fact that Hondurans toppled what was a competitive authoritarian regime under Hernandez. The fact that that Guatemalans managed to elect somebody from outside the criminal oligarchy that was strangling the country politically, not a small achievement. The fact that Brazil managed to avoid a real near miss in terms of a presidential coup and reaffirm its democracy in the last 5 years. Again, no small achievement. The Brazilians have done something that Americans couldn't do. They held accountable a leader who tried to undermine democracy. So I think it's important, given how difficult the conditions are, to pay attention to the actually pretty striking resilience of democracy in much of the region.
Thank you. Let me just challenge you for a second, because it's very provocative what you're saying. If you look 25 years ago, as you were saying, when we thought about the concept of plain democracies and hybrid regimes, etc., I would say, that probably Latin America had more democracy than it has now. When we think about plain democracies these days, we basically think of Uruguay. sort of the country where everybody wants to emigrate to, right? If you care about democracy. I think probably Argentina still fitted that category 25 years ago. Costa Rica, a country that,
Argentina was burning 25 years ago.
right. So, I mean, if you think in terms of electoral democracy, I would agree with you. You have seen countries where indeed, elections happen and the results are respected, which is key for democracy. I mean, election happened in Venezuela in 2024, and we see that results were not respected. But in many other places, 100%, alternation of power does occur. But if you go beyond elections, wouldn't you say that, some countries have experienced a very strong democratic decline?
Like which? I mean, human
Argentina?
rights, and so absolutely
Or
not.
Mexico, look at what's happening with Mexico's judicial independence. I mean, I think
Mexico worries me.
I mean,
Mexico worries me a lot. Mexico worries me a lot. I still think that democratic forces stand a pretty good chance, but Morena has way too much power, and the judicial reform is really worrisome. So Mexico, which didn't complete its transition to democracy until 2000, I think, sliding back into mild competitive authoritarianism like the United States.
Right.
But Argentina is still a democracy.
It is.
I mean, I had right-wing friends who were freaking out about the Kirchners. Kirchner's left power with free elections. I had left-wing friends who were freaking out about Milei, and Milei has played by democratic rules thus far. So again, there are all sorts of problems with corruption and with extreme public discontent. But human rights and civil liberties are still protected in Argentina.
I think there is a deterioration of the human rights situation. I mean, you see changes in the way they deal with protest, for example. I mean, some key protections have been dismantled, for the rights of women, etc. But I mean, I will never say
abortion rights,
no longer a democracy.
Abortion rights have been established in Argentina for the first time ever.
In the previous government, yes. But the ministry,
but that stands.
So how that will, whether that will change with the new Congress is still to be seen. I agree with you. You cannot say right now that Argentina has lost its democracy.
No, not far from it. Look, Latin America. I mean, if you look back, I'm old, man. I started studying Latin America in the 1980s. The degree of inclusion, the expansion of rights to women, to indigenous communities, to LGBTQ communities, to other historically excluded or oppressed groups, it's been a slow, difficult march. But Latin America is, whether it's Brazil or Colombia or Argentina or Mexico, light years from where it was when I started studying Latin America. And those things are threatened by an illiberal right. They've been rolled back in some places, terribly, like in El Salvador and Nicaragua. But for the most part, that process of inclusion, though threatened, and although it's triggered a right-wing reaction, an illiberal right-wing reaction, like in the United States, we haven't gone back to the 20th century in terms of inclusionary rights.
Let me take that.
Sorry to be too optimistic.
Yeah, no, the issue of religion, the culture wars, identity politics. I mean that are part of the political landscape, both in Latin America and the U.S. But many analysts are keen on comparing developments in the U.S. with those of prior or current authoritarian governments, both in Europe and in Latin America. Would you say that there are some particularities of the authoritarianism that is developing in the U.S., especially regarding, the cultural wars that is so prevalent in this administration?
I think so. There is, as we noted earlier, there is an illiberal right-wing reaction that is global, at least among sort of Western democracies, against what I view, at least, as important inclusionary reforms, moves towards greater gender, sexual, racial, and ethnic equality across democracies, both North and South, over the last 30 or 40 years. and there's a reaction against that. I think that is the fundamental driver of the reaction in the United States. Obviously, there are multiple causes of rising authoritarianism in the United States and the rise of the far right in Europe. But I think the principle, if I had to choose a single factor, I think it's a reaction against the United States' gradual transition to a truly multiracial democracy. The core Trumpist voter believes or feels like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them because there has been a really significant challenge to status hierarchies that have been in place in the United States for a very long time. You see some of that in Latin America. We see some of it in Brazil. There's no question that Bolsonarismo is in part a reaction to moves toward greater inclusion and equality, including racial equality in Brazil. You see some of it certainly in the rise of the far right in Chile as a reaction to steps toward greater progressive inclusion. You see it a little bit in Colombia and Argentina as well. But I think it's less of a driver of the reaction. The illiberal right, the role that crime and violence plays in strengthening the illiberal right is much greater than in the United States. And in most countries, it's more important than issues of wokeness or LGBTQ rights. That in most countries, that's confined mostly to an online minority. It does polarize that online minority, but it's not what's getting the far right elected.
Okay. Well, we have a long list of questions already from our audience, but I want to ask you a last question before I start, taking some of the questions that are written in the chat, because I think this is also very important, and everyone wants to know what can we do, right? And you have a study how democracies die, and I think most people would love to hear in your studies what are the areas that, if embraced by a broad sector, in this case of U.S. society, could turn the tide towards strengthening democracy rather than allowing it to deteriorate. Anything that we have learned from history that is embedded in American society to prevent authoritarianism. Any particular role, for example, that you think could play the women's movement or other movements?
Well, we actually don't know that much about the sort of best way to restore democracy from particularly from competitive authoritarian regimes. And no democracy as remotely as rich as the United States has ever broken down. So in some ways, we're in pretty new territory. But there are a few things we know. First of all, thankfully, unlike say, Chile in the early 80s or Argentina, late 70s, early 80s, thankfully there are multiple channels in the United States to contest this regime. And I would say there are three broadly. We still have elections. It is clear that we cannot rely entirely on elections. We cannot sit around and wait until 2026, 2028. We will lose our democracy long before that. But elections continue. I mean, if I had to bet a dollar on the way in which this authoritarian government will leave power, it's still most likely to be elections. So elections are an important avenue. The courts are an important avenue. The courts will not save us in the United States, but they continue to be an important avenue for slowing down some of the worst abuses of this government. And third, and importantly, protests, citizens. And that doesn't necessarily mean the kind of massive protests that we saw in several Latin American countries in the last 5 years, or even No King's protests. That's part of it. But citizens have to contest this in 1,000 different ways. And what it means mostly is that we have to citizens have to be engaged in politics, and they have to be engaged in organizations, and they have to be engaged in causes that they care about. It would be an exaggeration to say that the issue doesn't matter, but there are 1,000 different issues that it would be useful for our democracy for people to be involved in. So people should find the issue or two that they care about and be involved. We don't know which protest, which issue it will be that eventually allows the opposition to kind of turn the tide. It's impossible to know in advance. In Poland, it was an anti-abortion, or excuse me, an abortion rights protest that eventually gave the opposition the momentum it needed to win at the polls in 2023. Sometimes it's corruption. In Latin America, it's often been corruption that mobilizes people. But another lesson that I've taken from, particularly from Brazil lately, is that it's really important that public officials, that people who have the authority and the responsibility to defend democracy, and I mean politicians, I mean judges, but also I mean media actors, and even the powerful law firms and universities, they have to stand up and defend democracy. The biggest problem in the United States, and this is such a contrast to Brazil, is that our elite has stepped to the sideline. We have not pushed back against Trump's authoritarianism. The contrast between the U.S. Supreme Court, which helped to derail the court cases against Donald Trump, despite the fact that he tried to end our democracy, and then turned around and granted him vast immunity. Contrast that to the Brazilian Supreme Court, which very aggressively, first of all, recognized the threat that Bolsonaro posed from the beginning, and when he attacked democracy, moved very aggressively to ensure that he didn't run in future elections and that he was held accountable for his assault on democracy. That's how you defend a democracy. And in that sense, the U.S. elite, which is still sort of clinging to this myth of American exceptionalism, in which somehow there's something in our culture or our DNA that makes us immune from authoritarianism, which is total BS. We can learn from Brazil a lot.
That's a very interesting point. I mean, the need for American institutions and American civil society and America political elite to learn from Latin American countries.
If I could say one more thing, I mean, if
Sure.
there's one thing that Latin Americans have a lot of experience with, most Latin Americans, not Costa Ricans, but most Latin Americans have experience with, it is in fending off authoritarian governments, right? That's something, unfortunately, Peruvians and Argentines and Brazilians and Ecuadorians and Bolivians, Guatemalans, Salvadorans have had to do. This is not the first time that Salvadorans have had to organize against an authoritarian regime. And many Latin Americans have, at great risk to their own lives and livelihood, struggled to defend basic rights, to defend human rights, to defend civil liberties, to defend the right to vote in free elections. And most Latin Americans know that democracy doesn't come for free, right? It takes work. It takes sometimes running some risk. And that's another thing that I think North Americans who don't have this shared history of authoritarianism, at least most of us, have to learn that democracy doesn't come for free. We can't just sit on the sidelines and expect the institutions to work. There are times when people have to take risks and pay some price to defend a democracy.
I agree with you 100%, and I think we at Wool are, very, very much on the same page. I mean, fighting for democracy implies risks, and but it's a fight worth fighting. I want to turn into the Q&A because there are quite a large number of questions, and my team is working to systematize some of them. So I'm going to start with 2 or 3 questions for you, Steve. Here's the first one. We see a radical change in U.S. policies towards the Latin American and Caribbean region, witnessing the upscale and new forms of U.S. pressure and aggression towards Venezuela, but also Colombia, Brazil, etc. What are the risks for Latin American countries now and in the coming months? And how can they deal with these developments? I have another couple of questions here. What is the role of high-level systemic corruption in maintaining competitive authoritarianism? And is focusing on this useful for pushing back? And a third question, based on your knowledge of comparative politics of competitive authoritarianism, what do you think are the necessary conditions for achieving democratization and not seeing a continuation or worsening of the authoritarianization that you spoke about across the Americas? How can Movir, for example, in El Salvador, be successful?
Oof, boy, if I knew the answer to that one, I'd have a better paying job. Those are great questions. Let me try to jump in. Look, how I am not very well equipped to advise Latin American governments on how to deal with Trump, because frankly, nobody has, or very few governments throughout the world have figured it out. I mean, the Canadian government is having a very difficult time responding to Trump. The Japanese, the South Korean governments, the Danish government, Trump is threatening to steal Greenland. European governments are having an extraordinarily difficult time dealing with Trump. So Latin American governments in Colombia and Mexico, in Panama, in Brazil, that are facing sort of erratic, deeply unfair and illegal threats from the Trump administration, they're in good company in not knowing what to do. This is a very personalistic government. So Trump's whims are often carried out by his lackeys. So the policy decisions, whether we go to war in Venezuela, or whether we try to take back the Panama Canal, or whether we bomb cartels in Mexico, that's not going to be subject to debate in the U.S. foreign policy establishment. They're not going to be experts on those countries, career experts on those countries, deliberating over the value of those policy moves. Trump's just going to decide, or maybe it'll be Marco Rubio, maybe it'll be Bolsonaro's family that gets into Trump's inner circle. These are not decisions that are being made in a professional way, and that means it's very erratic. It's subject to Trump's narcissism, and that's led governments to across the world to sort of abase themselves and give Trump gifts and basically what's the translation for chupa medias?
Okay.
To humiliate themselves, to praise Trump in an effort to kind of win his favor. So I think the Brazilians have actually responded pretty effectively to Trump. I think they're that the kind of hardline or consistent defense of principles and policy that you've seen in Brazil has been pretty successful so far. We do know that it is, all things equal, usually better to stand up to Trump. But if you're if you're Panama, if you're Colombia, you don't have the wherewithal. You're not strong enough to take on Trump one-on-one. So Petro can't do what Lula does. Colombia is just too weak and dependent on the United States. So I'm really glad I'm not sitting in the presidency of Colombia or Panama or Mexico right now. These are really, really hard jobs. I think the Mexican government, actually, the Sheinbaum government, has also done a reasonably good job of dealing with Trump. But this is a day-to-day headache. It's extremely difficult. And it's really, really hard to predict day-to-day what the government will do. And we know that this government is willing to use tools, to use policy tools that are usually considered off the table, that are considered by most American policymakers to be unethical, and in many cases outright illegal. Right? It is under no law, under no set of laws, is it legal to just murder people in boats off the shore of Venezuela. This is just outright illegal behavior. But of course, nobody can stop them. So there's no easy answer. There's no easy answer. On the second question, corruption is really double-edged. Corruption can be very useful in consolidating an authoritarian regime because it allows an autocrat. You see this a fair amount in certainly in Russia, we saw it in Venezuela, in Hungary. You can buy off key people with corruption, and kind of wed them to the regime, because once you've been bought off through a corrupt deal, it's very hard to break because the government's got a lot on you. And so Fujimori was a great case of using corruption to kind of solidify authoritarian rule. But corruption, especially today in relatively democratic societies with still fairly independent media and much stronger judiciaries. That's another change over 25 years. Most Latin American judiciaries are strong, not Mexico, but other ones are stronger today than they were a quarter century ago. And so presidents who engage in corruption, whether it's Correa or Fujimori or Kirchner, or a succession of Peruvian and Salvadoran presidents, or Hernandez in Honduras, they end up busted. They end up facing serious consequences. Some of them end up in exile. Some of them end up in prison. And so their exposure for corruption is a real vulnerability for governments, both democratic governments and authoritarian ones. And it's a great rallying point for oppositions because nobody likes corruption. And so for oppositions, for example, in El Salvador, that face a very, very difficult challenge, corruption is a pretty useful bandera. Sorry to keep slipping into Spanish. It's a good way to mobilize a broad array of society. The problem in El Salvador, the challenge that, and this gets to the third question, that human rights defenders have in El Salvador, I think you guys could not have made a better choice in the Human Rights Award. I mean, any group that is willing to stand up for human rights and citizen rights in El Salvador today, wow, is worthy of our admiration and our praise, and needs all the defense we can provide it. The great challenge in El Salvador is very similar to Peru in the first half of the 1990s. You have an autocrat with massive popular support. And when 80 or 85% of the public supports the government and what it's doing, it is very, very it is demoralizing to oppose the government, and it can feel just incredibly ineffective. And so there are two things. First of all, it's one thing we know about politics is there is a law of gravity. Nobody stays at 85% forever. Nobody. Chavez didn't. Fujimori didn't. Correa didn't. And Bukele won't. There's never been an exception. Bukele will not defy the laws of political gravity. When he'll come down to earth, we don't know, but it will happen. And it'll probably happen pretty soon because governing El Salvador is hard. And people across the region are discontent. But to get back to the point, corruption is probably the way to do it. It was one of the ways in fact, it was a primary way that the opposition finally brought Fujimori down in Peru after a decade. And I think it'll probably be, and there's no question that the Bukele government is increasingly corrupt. You concentrate that amount of power and you will abuse it, and you will abuse it for personal gain. There's no question the Bukele family is doing that. I think corruption is probably going to be the principal sort of banner for successful opposition in El Salvador. It just may take a little while.
Those are, I mean, it's a very useful analysis, I think, especially for our colleagues in El Salvador who, as you say, deserve all of our support, but are struggling, right, to find a popular authoritarian. Some other, very interesting questions for you, Steve. You said that the dictatorship in the USA is reversible. Do you have confidence that the Republican Party won't do everything to stop fair elections next time? Can we hope to go back to democracy after 2028? In what? I'm going to read a few. In what ways might USA actions in Latin America influence how Americans view and accept domestic policy decisions, particularly in relation to US strikes in the Caribbean? How does this mean for how the US will define democracy in the future? It seems this is the third one. It seems there is a strong connection between populism in how authoritarians win power. Should the opposition that believe in democracy and human rights use populist strategies or styles to defeat the current more right-wing style of populism, or should it avoid populism completely?
Those are great questions, especially that third one. I'll start with the first. First of all, I would not call the United States a dictatorship, but I would call it a competitive authoritarian regime, which is much more of a hybrid. This is not Cuba. This is not Putin's Russia. It's not Stalinism. Am I confident that the Republicans won't try very hard to steal the 2026 election? I think it's very likely that the Republicans will try very hard to manipulate the 2026 election. They've already begun. I mean, the mid-decade gerrymandering in Texas is an open effort to maintain a control of the Congress, even if they lose the popular vote for the Congress. It is possible that the Democratic Party will win the popular vote for Congress in 2026, and that thanks to gerrymandering, the Republicans control the Congress. That is not very democratic, but that is a possibility, and it's made possible by deliberate efforts by Republicans to make this next election unfair. There will be efforts to make it more difficult to register and to vote in places. There will be efforts to put up obstacles to voting in areas that are overwhelmingly urban areas, for example, that are more democratic. There probably will be efforts to intimidate voters. There may be ICE and Border Guard and even National Guard, armed men, or maybe even paramilitary. There will probably be armed men near polling places, which is illegal, but I think could very well happen. So there'll be all kinds of efforts to intimidate voters, to make it harder for people in Democratic districts or Democratic regions and neighborhoods to vote. And there may be shenanigans after in terms of seizing ballot boxes and manipulating things after the vote. I think these things are almost certain to happen. In fact, they are already happening. The question is, will that be decisive? Fraud is hard. Fraud is hard to pull off. Think about Venezuela in 2024. I mean, it's hard to imagine a more uneven playing field than 2024 Venezuela, right? The opposition had no access to the media. the opposition could not even campaign legally above ground. All those state resources were in the hands of the governing party. All the media is in the hands of the governing party. And there is active, violent intimidation of voters and opposition activists. And yet the election was still 2-1 in favor of the opposition. Now, eventually Maduro just outright stole it. That's unlikely in the United States. What I'm saying is, even when you create a really uneven playing field, much, much more uneven than we'll have in the United States, even then, it's possible for opposition to win the vote count. And so, and fraud is hard in the United States. We don't have a lot of recent experience with it. Elections are really decentralized, so there will definitely be manipulation in some areas, but other areas they won't. The federal government has very little power over elections. It may try to assert it, but the vast bulk of the power for running elections is in the hands of state and local government. So they will try. The question is how successful they will be. Now, it's possible, if it's a really close race, that the shenanigans and manipulation that Republicans try to turn off and try to pull off, it's possible that will be decisive. If it's a 2 or 3 point margin, that might be decisive. But it's also possible that the opposition will win the 2026 election despite a slightly uneven playing field, or somewhat uneven playing field. I think we don't know. It's not a. You should certainly not think that, even though that although the administration is going to try to manipulate this election, it's not a done deal. It's almost never a done deal. It wasn't even a done deal in Venezuela in 2024. And so the opposition needs to contest this election, and it could win. The third election, populism, great question. It kind of depends on the population you're talking about. I think this is a longer story than I should get into, but the level of public discontent with the status quo, with political elites, with elites in general, with what I like to call the political establishment, those levels of public discontent are so high that a certain degree of populism is necessary to win elections these days. It's just really hard to put on a tie and jacket and dress and talk like an establishment politician, and like a 20th century politician, and expect to win. Over and over and over again, we're seeing political outsiders, populists, people from outside the system who talk differently, who propose, to shake up the system one way or another. Those guys are always finishing first and second and ending up in the ballotage, right? Whether it is Chile or Ecuador or Bolivia or Peru or Argentina, the evidence is pretty, and I think this is mostly a product of social media and public discontent. But you just can't win elections the way the way you used to win elections. And so the short answer is some dose of populism is probably necessary to defeat a populist. I've had this conversation with opposition figures in Mexico. I think the Mexican opposition needs to learn something from AMLO. This does not mean that you borrow from AMLO's playbook 100%, but AMLO knows how to reach Mexican voters in the 21st century. And the opposition parties in Mexico demonstrably do not. I think they need to learn. And
No, buenas tardes, colega. Licenciado Jaime, no, ahí el tribunal, el juzgado de los civiles mercantiles emite una sentencia y la sentencia, la certificación de la sentencia acompañada de un oficio que el mismo tribunal emite lo mandan al registro de la propiedad para efectos de inscripción. Si ha sido vía judicial, pues si ha hecho la prescripción, obviamente que es del tribunal el que emite la resolución, la sentencia, no tiene que ver ningún notario ahí de por medio.
we're going to have to kind of innovate and develop a more democratic populism, because we're living in a populist era.
That's a concept to be developed, really. Thank you. We still have many questions, but we need to start closing, unfortunately. So I'm just going to pick some of the last questions that we got before we close. Just 2 or 3 last questions. Nearly everyone is aware of the removers to El Salvador, and that rightly has been the focus of many. However, there are removals to other countries, including Costa Rica. What can be done to focus on nations, states like Costa Rica, that may be responsive to political pressures? Costa Rica, for example, depends on tourism, and most tourists are not supportive of human rights abuses. What could a focus on potentially responsive states like Costa Rica offer for activists looking for hope? 2 more questions. The word democracy is used all the time. However, women don't have equal rights anywhere in the world. Is that democracy when women are second and third class citizens? And the last question, which I think is a great question to close, no pressure on this one. What gives you hope in this context? What can civil society do to resist authoritarian concentration of power?
Oof. Okay, I'm not sure I have any great answers on the first question on Costa Rica, although the questioner herself or himself provides a little bit of an answer. It is to me, it's very sad to see the Trump administration employ all of U.S. state power and economic power to bully governments, democratic governments, to bully or bribe governments into engaging or cooperating with unethical and sometimes illegal behavior. And so it pains me to see the Costa Rican government cooperate with the Trump administration's deportations. But it's, it's not that hard to understand why it happens. It wouldn't happen in Brazil. It wouldn't happen in a big country. But Costa Rica is just too small, too vulnerable to resist that kind of bullying. So what can be done? I mean, the governments have to. There has to be sort of a price for cooperating with the Trump administration. This goes for things for businesses that cooperate with the Trump administration in the United States, but also foreign companies and foreign actors and maybe foreign governments. A consumer boycott, a tourist boycott of Costa Rica, as long as it is cooperating with deportation policies that violate human rights, is a pretty interesting idea. Would it work? I have no idea. But consumer boycotts are an important form of protest. On democracy and women, you certainly cannot have. It's a matter of more or less, right? If women do not have formal equal rights as men, as was the case, everywhere prior to the 20th century, you have no democracy. If women have the same formal rights as men, but those rights are not protected in practice, which is true in almost all countries today, you have less democracy. And so the more that you can make the practice approximate the letter of the law, the more democratic you are. And again, forgive me for being too optimistic, but in Latin America and the United States, there has been pretty steady progress over the last 30, 40 years in terms of protection of women's rights and women's political representation. It's night and day compared to. I remember campaigning for a U.S. Senate campaign in the early 1990s when there were 2 women in the U.S. Senate, 2% representation. The percentage of women in both the House and the Senate has dramatically increased over the last 30 years. And that's also true across Latin America. Does that mean that women have equal rights? Obviously not. So agree that you get the democracy is a continuum. It's not an on or off. The more that we progress towards equality across races, ethnicities, religions, genders, the more democratic we get. What gives me hope? That's a tough one these days. There are a bunch of things that give me hope, though. One of the things is that Latin Americans, and here I really can generalize, without exception, show that they continue to want and demand the right to vote out governments they don't like. Mm-hmm. There is nobody in Latin America clamoring for the China model or the Russia model. El Salvador is in a weird moment, but that will pass. Latin Americans can remain as disgusted as they are with their parties and their politicians, as willing as they are sometimes to vote for populist outsiders who may not be fully committed to democracy. The overwhelming majority of Latin Americans continue to demand the right to vote out governments they don't like. And I think as long as that continues to be the case, there's going to be a solid push for democracy in Latin America. It's going to be almost impossible to consolidate long-term dictatorships. Now, obviously, Nicaragua and Nicaragua in particular calls that claim into question. But even in Venezuela, Venezuelans are still fighting for the right to elect the government that they want, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you for saying that, because I needless to say, to defend human rights and to work to promote and to defend democracy, you do need hope. So we're very grateful for those words. That was a really powerful conversation, Steve, and we thank you, everyone. To everyone who asked questions, and it's incredible how fast time passed by. But we do need to start closing. It has been an extraordinary morning, and we're very pleased to have honored the courage of Movir, activists who continue organizing for democracy inside El Salvador, despite enormous risk. And we have recognized Senator Tim Kaine's decades of principled leadership on Latin American human rights and democracy. And we have had the privilege to discuss democracy and authoritarianism with Professor Steve Levitsky, one of the world's leading voices on this issue. And I think we hope, that we will continue this conversation because the challenges are great. I think that, there is a common thread running through everything we have discussed today. Democracy doesn't die in a single dramatic moment. It erodes gradually through the normalization of abuses, the silencing of dissent, the weakening of the institutions. It happens when we look away, when we become numb to what would have once shocked us, when we accept the unacceptable. And I believe the Washington Post says that democracy dies in darkness. I think democracy dies in inaction. So Walla is here to take action. And although this is a difficult environment, we take the fight for democracy and human rights very seriously. But the environment in which we are working is incredibly challenging. And our advocacy team in Washington is pushing back against a political environment that is increasingly hostile to human rights principles. It means we are defending not just democracy in Latin America, we are defending democracy and we're defending the very principles that human rights and democratic values should guide U.S. policy here in the United States. And I have to say, this work is exhausting and it's often thankless, but it is absolutely essential, and we are convinced and committed to what we do. Walla stands at the intersection of these struggles in the region and in the United States, because what happens in Latin America matters for the United States, and what happens in the United States reverberates throughout the Americas. We cannot separate these fights. The defense of democracy is not a domestic issue or a foreign policy issue. It is the issue of our time. And this is the work you support, and it is your support that makes our work possible. So I do want to close by saying that WOLA cannot do this work without you, and I will be very direct about what we are facing. The funding environment for human rights work is deteriorating, and foundations are under attack. Government support for human rights monitoring is under threat, and at the same time, we need, funding for our work more than ever. So I'm asking you to make a contribution to WOLA, not next week, not when things calm down, because we don't know when they will calm down, but if possible, hopefully today, because the threats we're facing won't wait. So your donation, whether it's $50, $500, of course, we also accept $50,000, directly supports our work. It supports our monitoring and advocacy in the entire region. It supports our partners. It supports that we can continue briefing Congress when others won't. It provides a platform for human rights defenders who have no other voice in Washington. It allows us to document abuses that otherwise would go unrecorded or unaddressed. You can donate right now by visiting the link shared in the chat, or going directly to our website, or speaking with our team. If you are able to make a larger commitment, please consider becoming a monthly donor or joining our Legacy Society. I do want to repeat this. Every single contribution makes a difference. So we encourage you all to donate to WOLA. Let me close with this. Dr. Steve Levitsky reminded us today that history shows us that authoritarianism is not inevitable. It requires committed institutions willing to do the hard work to stop authoritarians from staying in power. It requires people willing to stand up even when it's difficult. It requires resources, courage, and solidarity. WOLA chooses to fight, and today we are asking you to fight alongside us. Thank you, Steve, so much for joining us today. We very much appreciate it.
It's my privilege.
Thank you, everyone, for your support, and we will continue this essential work, hopefully, with your help. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Recording stopped.